Welcome. Good day, everyone. We're glad to be here with you. Thank you for joining us for this Container Journal webinar. Our topic today is You've Adopted K8s, Kubernetes. Now what? Key insights from effective management and observation. Today's webinar is sponsored by Mirantis. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'm going to serve as host and moderator. We have two great panelists today. This is going to be a discussion about Kubernetes and sharing some tips and tricks and experiences with you, our audience. And we also love to have your questions too. So I encourage you to enter questions into either the Q&A or into the public chat. We're happy to kind of monitor both and inject those into our conversation. So just a few housekeeping items. One is that we're going to record, or we are recording the webinar, and all attendees will receive an email with a link to today's recording. Now, we don't have any slides. That's the good news. No death by PowerPoint today. So we're really going to just engage in content and in topic. And as I mentioned, both of our speakers love questions. So we're going to get to that very quickly. All righty. So let's move on to our topic. Oh, I forgot to mention too, we do have 4 gift cards we're giving away at the end. So stick around to the end, find out if you're one of our winners. Our topic again is You've Adopted K8s. Now what? Key insights for effective management and observation. All right, let's introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Miska. He's Senior Director of Engineering at Mirantis. Miska, welcome. Tell us a little about yourself. Tell us a little bit about Mirantis. Also, tell us a little bit about your K8s Kubernetes experience.
Hey, great to be here. So first of all, about my background. So I have been involved with the cloud native ecosystem since very early days. Basically, I was running my own startup since year 2014 to 2015, where we created our own container orchestration system. It was the time before Kubernetes was kind of a thing. We also moved on with our startup to start supporting Kubernetes orchestrator when the Kubernetes was crowned the king of the container orchestration, and really trying to build always products and technologies that would help actual developers to take most out from these beautiful container technologies. And I'm a little bit of a serial entrepreneur. So basically, I have been running my own startups since year 2000. And so I have been in the high-tech software business for many, many years. So I joined Mirantis a year ago. And with Mirantis, I'm head of the open source initiatives. We have 2 big projects. One of them is the Lens Kubernetes IDE, which is a tool for anybody who needs to deal with the Kubernetes clusters on a daily basis to basically take control of those clusters, have the full situational awareness, what's going on in their clusters, and truly to accelerate software development and kind of operations or on top of Kube. And another product, open source product we are working on is the K0s. It's the Kube distro, zero friction Kube distro. It's a super tiny footprint Kube distro. What makes it special that it can actually support the smallest use cases like IoT devices, but going all the way to the biggest of biggest clusters. This product is still very young, or the project is still very young, but getting quite a bit of traction over the last couple of months. So yeah, those are the projects I'm heading here at Mirantis. Mirantis as a company, so we do container orchestration, and we have our strong roots with the OpenStack technology. We serve some of the biggest companies on this planet who want to accelerate their adoption with containers or any kind of virtualized environments. Yeah, that's yeah.
Good description, and great to know your background too, and understand how you're coming to this conversation about Kubernetes and containers and container orchestration. Next is Bob Russelman. Bob is an analyst with Accelerated Strategies Group. Bob and I actually work together. We both work together at Accelerated Strategies. Bob's also an author, of course, software architect, engineer. Really, he spent his career doing software as well as a lot of other fun things. Like I know he's a cartoonist too. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Bob, tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, I am Bob Russelman, and welcome to my home research center in Southern California, Los Angeles. I live 1 block from Sony Studios, so if things ever get bad, I can go out and be an extra in a Viking movie, which is part of my ambition. But regardless of that, I've been doing tech for a long time. And with regard to Kubernetes, let me put it this way. Back in 2000, when this thing called the internet came along, and this thing called HTML, I said, oh, my world is about to change dramatically. And it did. And then around 2015, 2016, I saw this thing come down called Borg from Google, and these things called containers and container orchestration frameworks. And I said, oh no, things are going to change dramatically again. And they have. And I've been involved with Kubernetes at a pretty detailed level for about 4 years now. I write about it. I do teach it. I've moved on to doing more online instruction, basically because welcome to COVID-19 and my COVID-19 haircut. So I'm intrigued by the technology. I think it's an important technology. I think it's not a solution for every problem. We need to be aware of that. But here I am, and I still write about it just about every week.
Excellent. I know you get to work with a lot of technologies that utilizing Kubernetes as an analyst and, a writer, author, instructor, software creator. Yeah. So lots of good things. Right. Very cool. Let's start out with a poll for our audience. It's always good to kind of get a feel for who is participating with us. We get to introduce ourselves to you all. So we want to learn a little bit about you. I'm going to start this poll just asking what's your primary job function. Let's see. Hopefully you see that. Dave, let me know if that's showing up correctly, if I did this right. So while we have that open, you mentioned Miska. It's sort of when Kubernetes was crowned king or queen, whatever you use. It seems like that's all we talk about when we talk about container orchestration, but that's not the only technology. Certainly is a dominant technology today. Agree?
Yeah, and of course we can also see a lot of discussion around Mirantis is also, we have many customers who are still using Docker Swarm. So when Mirantis acquired Docker Enterprise business, so we have also a lot of customers who are still using Docker Swarm, and they are happy users, and there is not necessarily always a need for them to move on with Kube. So that's exactly right. So there are also some other solutions out there. And we know that some of the very popular services from AWS, from Azure, for example, these container services, they are not Kubernetes, but they are simple, environments where people can run their containers. And they are quite popular still. So there is definitely a choice if you want to work with containers.
Well, let's do this. Just looking at our poll here to share with you all what we're seeing for our data. It looks like about 16% identify themselves as a developer, another 28% as an architect, 4% as a CTO. So there you've got, nearly half the population of our webinar today. We also have DevOps folks, 18%, operator, IT admin, sysadmin, SRE type person, 15%, with some smattering of data analyst and student and a few other things. So definitely a strong technical audience, software audience, and DevOps, I think, are the two primary, drivers of the folks that are with us today. So spot on for, of course, our topic. So not surprised based on the title of our conversation and the landing page for the webinar. Okay, great. Let's do this. Let's start out with, software engineers, software developers are always working with new technology and adopting new things. It's just part of I kind of learned that early in my career, is just you're in constant learning. And how would you describe a typical adoption curve of how people might go about adopting Kubernetes? If you're not already doing Kubernetes today, how do people usually get started? And I'm going to ask this question because one of the reputations of Kubernetes is that it's fairly complex. If you go into it, kind of hearing that, sometimes that might color how you think you're going to maybe work with it. Bob, do you want to start the conversation there?
Sure, I'll start the conversation. I think there's a delineation we need to make in Kubernetes adoption, and that's really greenfield, brownfield. If you have this existing set of applications, or you have code that's working for you, and it might not be working to 100% satisfaction, but 95% satisfaction, and then we say, okay, we want to switch over to Kubernetes. And there's a reason for that. But that workflow that's going to come from doing that sort of transformation is much different than going greenfield. Because greenfield, it's just there. You can containerize from the word get-go. You can create your infrastructure, your storage mechanisms, everything from the start. And what happens, I've seen it in a couple companies, because I do go into companies, very big companies, that are adopting Kubernetes, and particularly microservices, in their departments. We don't see this as company-wide mandates, but we see it at the department level. They have a lot of problems retrofitting their applications into the Kubernetes environment. And that goes more for around context segmentation. In other words, getting all the data structures to line up properly. That's very, very hard for them. So I guess the first thing is somebody saying, look, we've adopted Kubernetes, and then the follow-up question becomes, okay, what do you plan to do with it? Well, we're going to transform our application from our application A into application B. That's good, but now we need to understand fundamentally the transformation strategy and the risk points. Big one of the risk points. What risk am I incurring by doing this? And I can't say this is a cookie cutter answer, right? It's always going to be this risk, that risk, but we need to be aware of that. And sometimes I see that, and many times I don't. People just go on and they don't do their risk analysis and build contingency around that risk analysis.
Jump right in, Mishka. I'm sure you have perspective about this too.
Yeah, I have been so much involved with companies of different sizes over the years, and also seeing how they are trying to adopt Kubernetes. So once the cluster is set up, nowadays, luckily, that's the easy part to create the cluster. In the early days, there was a lot of time and money put also on that part. So nowadays, that's becoming much more easier. But usually what happens is that there is not very clear workflows for people to work on. They basically, I can see that happening over and over again, that companies and organizations, they start kind of inventing this thing from scratch. Everybody's doing the same inventing kind of from scratch. How do they want to actually work with Kubernetes? So, because it's a huge concept, new concept, and it also involves quite often some platform engineering. How do they create this kind of centralized kind of pane of glass where the site reliability engineers can see things, but also how to provide visibility for the developers, and how the code that in the end, if I'm a developer, I have my VS Code open, I will type in my code. So how does this code that I'm typing actually get deployed into this production cluster? So do we need to set up some GitOps workflows? Do we integrate with CI/CD? So many different things. And because there is no kind of standards on how these things should, so there is no opinionated system. So it's very much up to the opinions of people, how they actually want to start using Qt. So I think many people are a little bit stuck on that phase, and it will take actually quite a bit of time to realize how they want to move ahead once the kube clusters are created.
One of the things I found useful is 12-factor app. I'm a big fan of 12-factor app, and it's a set of 12 principles you can follow to deploy to create, deploy, and maintain distributed applications at scale. And one of the principles, I think it's the fourth one, I don't remember the order it's called, it's called build, run, release. It's a very cookie cutter approach at a conceptual level, but it really is that everything you build, you run, release, and that everything exists in a central repository, and all artifacts emit out of that central repository due to a predictable release cycle that's automated. And that becomes tricky, but Kubernetes molds very well into that because they have another principle that builds on that called dev prod parity. And dev prod parity, what that says is you use the same release path to go to production as you do to go to development. So for example, what you never ever do, I call it the Friday night birthday party. It's Friday night and your kid's birthday is coming up on Saturday morning and you have to get the birthday cake, right? If you don't get the birthday cake, bad things are going to happen. And it's Friday night, and what happens is the site goes down, the service goes down, and you're sitting Friday night trying to fix it, and you get the fix, and you have this little jar file or this zip file or this container or something, and it works in dev real well, and you got to get that birthday cake. So instead of going through your release cycle, what you do is what could possibly go wrong? You copy it over into production, the site's back up, you go home, get the birthday cake, you're here Saturday morning, and then Saturday night, terrible things happen again. And what they talk about in 12-factor app is you never do that. It gives you a way to release consistently through dev prod parity. Now that's just incidental, 12 principles, but the principles are, they're sound. They're not for everything, and there's different opinions about how much of this we should bite and how much of this we shouldn't, but it's a fairly consistent, understandable, fairly simple approach to doing Kubernetes development at scale in a consistent manner. And I recommend people look at it. 12factorapp.net, I think it is.
Yeah,
I agree.
I put the Wikipedia page out there too, but yeah, it is 12factor.net.
Right. Yeah, and I just published an illustrated guide to 12-factor app. There's my my little blast for myself. Yeah, do illustrated guides to 12-factor app.
So let's take that the next step then. Our title again is so you've adopted K8s. Now what's next? You talk about the workflow, Mishka. How do you discern that? I'd imagine, is it driven by the application? Is it driven more about how you develop things? What's the kind of driving patterns that will help you figure that out?
Yeah, that's the thing, that after all these years, I'm still not quite happy with my workflow. It's always something that I feel that there is something that I can always improve. For example, like what we are doing is quite much with our teams, and we are deploying to Kube all the time. So we have been building our development tool chain around Scaffold, and basically we are running that Scaffold from our own, of course, our own the Kube observability tool, the Lens. So it allows us actually to see on real time when a developer hits save on his VS Code. So automatically the rebuilding starts happening, and it's happening inside the cluster, and it gets deployed, in cluster. And I can see that visually all the time, all these new pods coming up, the old pods going away. I can see the logs in real time. So that's where we are at the moment, but I feel that there are still so many other things, because some of the missing parts of this workflow is that how can I ease up the debugging and setting some breakpoints in live software running inside the Kube cluster, and how do I do profiling of the software? How do I start optimizing? Of course, these are kind of luxury problems for many people, because not many people are even this far with their workflows. But those are the type of issues that we are trying to solve even ourselves today. So I feel personally that there is no kind of one clear solution that anybody could just take and start using and be a hero just like that. So I think it will still require quite a bit of research and fine-tuning for your own needs, unfortunately.
So let's talk a little bit about then, as you've worked through your own adoption of using Kubernetes, how do you take it to the rest of the organization? In software, we're famous for sort of putting layers between things, just kind of treat that as a black box, or do you really need to help the organization understand the whole Kubernetes architecture and the philosophy behind it in order to start to scale its use across multiple teams, multiple projects and apps? Bob, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, I think it's like anything else. Everybody needs to have a common background in Kubernetes. You just got to understand the basics. Your clusters, your pods, your services, RBAC, security, stuff like that. And that that's fairly easy to watch. There's a couple. You can watch a 1 or 2 hour video. But the other thing that I recommend is that the developers start actually creating even small experimental applications that run under Kubernetes. Now, one of the roadblocks to Kubernetes is the complexity, particularly around cluster provisioning. So if you go out to Azure or Google Cloud or any of those, you can spin up a cluster and get a public IP address and stuff like that, and you can destroy it. But it's not a lot of fun at the desktop level, where a lot of developers work. A lot of developers just work at the desktop level. So one of the things that I've been doing is I've worked with a technology called Kubernetes and Docker, K-I-N-D. And what Kubernetes and Docker allows you to do is you can create multi-node Kubernetes clusters as Docker containers, and you can put it behind a load balancer. And if people are interested, contact me. I have some instructional interactive stuff out there that'll show you how to do it. But the benefit of it is that now the developer, we're developers. We want to mess things up. We want to play. We want to see the parts work. And this allows you to really have a rich Kubernetes experience at the desktop level. Also, it allows you to have a rich service mesh experience at the desktop level. Because what we're seeing is that, in the beginning, it's like, what's the joke on Kubernetes? Well, I don't like the technology. Well, wait 6 minutes, it'll change. Right? I mean, right yesterday, now we have autopilot. That just came through my desk yesterday. So what working at the desktop level allows you to do, allows you to get familiar with Kubernetes, but it also allows you to get familiar with the evolution. For example, as I mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to imagine a Kubernetes installation without a service mesh. And once you lay a service mesh, i.e. Istio, on top of it, or any of the other products, now that level of complexity increases, and it decreases dramatically. But when you have a desktop toy or a desktop tool that allows you to see all of this stuff in action, it serves as a common educational experience for an organization. Some organizations will adopt Kubernetes as a way of life company-wide. Others will do it at a product level, and others will do it at a departmental level. What do they care? I'm just representing myself as an IP address. Here's the IP address. What's going on behind it, you don't care about. And that's part of the beauty of container orchestration, is the high degree of encapsulation and isolation.
Excellent. Mishka, I'm asking you to jump in here too while you're doing that. Just a reminder to our audience, please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm going to start a poll while you're talking, Mishka, about how far along you are on your DevOps journey. So that'll pop up in front of everybody while Mishka's talking about it. So don't let that get you distracted. Go ahead, Mishka.
So what was the question?
The question is, how do you scale? How do you take it to the rest of the organization and start to broaden the use of Kubernetes across multiple teams, projects, et cetera?
Right. So it very much depends, because some of the people, so first of all, it's not like Kubernetes must be used by everybody. So what we have seen is that Kubernetes somehow will organically find its place nowadays within organizations. So for example, some old legacy applications, some years ago, it was kind of some kind of idea, and there was a little bit of activity and momentum around containerizing some legacy applications and running those in container orchestration like Kubernetes. But I don't actually see that happening so much anymore. So nowadays, I think it's more about new application development. And basically the rollout, therefore, within enterprises, at least, happens as the new projects are getting started. So I think it's no point to start kind of forcing everybody to use Cube before there is an actual need to start something new. And quite often when something new is started, actually, if there is some kind of momentum in the company around Cube, so most likely all of these new projects are then also, at least they will try to apply Cube principles for those applications. So that's what I'm seeing, at least.
Good. Interesting results on our poll too. It looks like about, well, let me kind of run down this way. We have about 9% that are doing a proof of concept stage, another 14% who are in development with Kubernetes, not in production yet. People that have it in production is 27%. It's about a quarter of our audience. And then the other half of the audience is in the education learning stage. So a lot of things we're talking about, sort of those beginning steps, super helpful to a lot of the folks that we're talking with, as well as the 27% that have gone all the way to production with their applications in Kubernetes. Well, let's talk about what some of the biggest challenges are to adopting Kubernetes across the organization. You mentioned, Mishka, it sounded like almost you want to have ways of leveraging the learnings of how to work with Kubernetes, how to set it up, configure it, how to make it part of your workflow, your pipeline, and share that across multiple teams so everybody doesn't have to go through that same exact learning curve. You get some institutional knowledge across development teams, correct?
Yeah, I think there is a huge kind of empowerment or kind of growth in the coming years around the platform engineering kind of people who are trying to create these type of internal products for companies actually to accelerate use of these new technologies, to surface information, better for everybody to see and to work more effectively, basically, with all these cool new technologies and toys. I think it comes down to the training and the insane difficulty of trying to hire, experienced Kubernetes developers. I think they are just so difficult to find. So I think that's one of the challenges. And one of the biggest challenges, to be honest. So the question is that how can we make, Kubernetes somewhat more easy to use, something that people can just start experimenting and learning themselves more easily, and make it more kind of accessible and things like that. So we have been, of course, trying to do something, trying to help and ease of pain for people with our tooling to help people to get adopted more fast. But I think in the end, it's the educational challenge. How do we educate more people to learn Kubernetes and understand actually what is Kubernetes all about? I think people should understand that Kubernetes, it's almost like an operating system for the future. It's the distributed operating system for a distributed compute. And once you master this operating system called Kubernetes, you can do pretty much anything nowadays.
Any thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, I have a lot. The first thing I want to build on what Mishka said is that Kubernetes is a very, very powerful technology. We need to remember where it came from. It came from Google. It was Google's way of running the internet, and it still is. And Google has 1 quadrillion users. It's made for very, very big applications doing very big things. But like any other technology, people tend to want to adopt it for various reasons. So the question I always ask when people say, well, we want to do Kubernetes, I say, how many consumers, and by consumers I mean either services or human beings, do you anticipate wanting to use your service or your application? And people say, oh, I don't know, maybe 20. Well, gee, that's just not enough. I mean, that's just not enough at scale. You can get by very nicely with a virtual machine running Docker Compose, get 50 to 70% of the benefits, the internal DNS structures that Kubernetes provides, the networking, all that stuff, and it's living on a nice VM in one little local host location, and your 20 services will live happily ever after, right? The point being is that discussion of what is this thing we're building and who's going to be using it becomes critical. And there's another publication I read yesterday, they did a study, and that we need to be careful that just because we're using a cloud provider doesn't mean we're going to be saving money. No matter what, Kubernetes is Kubernetes. Whether you're running it on Azure, whether you're running on GKE, whether you're running it on OpenShift, or anything where you're running it, in Hotel California here, there's still that level of complexity. And you need to know what you're doing. The service provider can only remove so much from you, right? And you need to be aware of that. And so I guess to wrap it up is understand that Kubernetes, again, is for big applications, right? And if you have a small application, you might want to think about, is this really the best solution for you?
By the way, there was a nice kind of quick conversation going on between Amir and Michael talking about Kind. I think you may have mentioned
Kubernetes and Docker, yeah.
Yeah, if you want to say a little bit about Kind and the load balancing capabilities.
Oh, yes, what to do. Let me see. I'm not seeing it, but okay, here's what to do. If you go out actually to catacota.com/WrestleBob, I have 5 lessons on how to use Kubernetes and Docker. It's out there. I put them out there free for the world. And one of the things that you can do, Kubernetes and Docker, it creates multiple nodes based on Docker containers under a common Kubernetes as a cluster, as a Kubernetes cluster. And then the other thing you can do is, and I demonstrate this in the Catacota/WrestleBob Kubernetes under load balancing, is you can load, in my case, I use Metal LB. You can put a load balancer in front of it. So now you can, under Kubernetes services, you have a variety of services. You have cluster IP, you have node port, and you have load balancer. Cluster IP and node port is all internal to the cluster. So it's very hard to do really production work where I have a cluster and people are using it. But once you can expose your clusters under a load balance technology, i.e. Metal LB, now you have a cluster that has an IP. You can use Kubernetes, you can use port forwarding to forward your application into that Kind cluster. And for all intents and purposes, you got yourself a cluster on your desktop that the world can use. It's a very good way to learn a lot of the intricacies of Kubernetes. And the good news is if something goes wrong, you just destroy the cluster and start all over again. None of your work gets lost. Is that helpful? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, very much so. I put a link to your Catacota.
Thank you.
Site. Was it the Intro to Kubernetes and Docker Kind, that one?
Yeah. There's 4 of them out there, yeah.
Yeah, I'll put the link directly to that for folks.
I don't want to hear people click clacking on my thing while I talk with it. If there's one out there under load balancing, I think, and there's one under using a service mesh too. So I actually bring up Kubernetes under Istio. And you can do that on your desktop. Feel free, go out, enjoy it. It works. There you go. It's Kubernetes and it works.
Some great content there. Mishka, I know this webinar isn't a commercial for Mirantis, and so I don't want to turn it into that. But you mentioned the kinds of tools and the approach that you were taking and the things that you were putting together. Can you say a little bit more about what parts of the problem are you working on to solve, if you will, or help add to the ecosystem of Kubernetes?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Lens IDE is probably, and I can actually say that it's by fact, it's the most popular user interface and visualization observability technology for Kubernetes. So just I can back up this claim by just pointing people to look at the GitHub repo and the statistics. So it is one of the most popular open source projects around Kubernetes in general. So we have more than 13,000 stargazers in there. It's hugely popular, 150,000 users already. Tens of thousands of companies are using it. So we are basically, with that tool, we hope that people can kind of experiment and learn, Kubernetes much more fast, because they can understand actually what is happening in their clusters. It's extendable. So companies in the Kubernetes ecosystem can build their extensions to Lens to surface information from their technology stacks. Like we have integrations through the extensions with Aqua Security, with Kubernetes, with Google Cloud Platform, and some others. So basically, it will allow direct integration with this Lens tool to work with these other technologies as well, and to visualize them and command those. So that's one product. The second product, as mentioned earlier, so we have the K8s. That's the super tiny kube distro that can be used for smallest of the smallest use cases, but it also scales up to the some of the biggest use cases. And of course, with Mirantis, we have customers, with all different sizes, and we need to serve different scales. So this product is suitable for that. If you look at our enterprise offerings, so of course we have then these huge products which are aimed for some of the bigger companies, but they are also free to try out. So even individuals and single developers, they can go to Mirantis website and download and try out these even bigger products if they want. So that's what we are doing. I think, especially if I look at this audience that we have in here, it would be nice to know if some of you in here in this audience have already been using Lens maybe before, because it's quite popular, and I highly recommend people to take a look at that.
Yeah, feel free to drop a note in chat if you're already using Lens. Yeah, just to make a very general observation, oftentimes when we introduce new technologies, it has sort of its own life cycle of we use it for the problem that it was intended to solve. And then we start to address sort of the downstream questions or issues, like how do you operate it? How do you monitor it? How do you secure it? Of course, that happens with Kubernetes as well. A lot of interest and buzz about observability and monitoring of Kubernetes. Any suggestions, tips and tricks on that end of it? Mishka, maybe you want to jump in first.
Yeah, so I think there are two different kind of angles there. So first of all, if we think about how operators and IT admins usually want to surface this information, is they will use the Grafana. Prometheus is almost becoming like a standard technology for surfacing metrics from these clusters. So often people will install the logging, monitoring, alerting stack built around Grafana. Is going to be integral part of that. Prometheus alert managers. So that's a very common pattern, and I think luckily there are quite a good documentation all around the internet how to actually connect your kube clusters into this type of monitoring systems. And then we have, in the other hand, we have these developers, and they want to basically see the world from a little bit different type of angle. They usually want to see the world in a way where the gravity is centered around their own application, and then the kind of world is wrapping around their own application. They don't care so much about stuff that is beyond their own application. For there is also various tooling available. Of course, the Lens tooling that we are doing, it's a one choice. But I think it's almost becoming like a standard, I must say, already, the Lens tooling for this particular purpose, because it will automatically do all these visualizations and everything for the any applications that the developers might be working on.
It's a question actually in chat, Mishka, about Lens and Docker. Can you do that on premise, or is it really just for containerized cloud instances?
So Lens extensions, they can basically work in any kind of environment. So Lens, first of all, that's a desktop application. It runs on your local machine. And those extensions are just, plugins that you install on your local machine as well. Lens talks to these kube clusters using the Kubernetes API. So Lens can definitely work if you have an access to your on-prem cluster. So Lens can definitely work with on-prem Docker Enterprise clusters, and I have seen it happening already. So that's definitely possible, and it works.
Great. Do you want to take a crack at the observability topic, Bob? And while you do that, I'm going to put up a poll about what are some of the biggest challenges in working with Kubernetes. So,
all right. Well, the fast one on observability is, it's built in. You can't fix what you can't see. You can't know what you can't see. So it's not an option. You've got to have observability. The good news is that a lot of technologies, they build their observability. And for example, Istio, which is the service mesh technology, which lives on top of Kubernetes, comes with this notion of add-ons. And you can just, under Istio, you just go add-ons, and automatically you get, there's Grafana, there's Calio, which is the service mesh observability dashboard. There's a whole lot of tools that get built in automatically. So you're going to get that. The other thing I do recommend is that people get a sense of the open source standard, which is open telemetry, to get a sense of how observability works. And we can always make it go away into dashboards, and that's good. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do, but we need to understand about how requests get mapped through a multi-node or a multi-service environment. And that's fairly straightforward. That's what we call a synchronous interaction, request response, web page, give me my response. Where things get really tricky is when we start doing, when we're in an asynchronous event-driven environment, which more modern applications are going to, just given the complexity of scale, that we can't have asynchronous things going back and forth and tying up interactions. We just need to send messages up, have them consumed and responded to. And observing a message path, or not message isn't the right word, observing a transaction path in an asynchronous environment is difficult. It's very difficult, but as we see the trends in applications to move more to event-driven paradigms, being able to do that type of observation becomes critical. OpenTelemetry allows you to do that. The standard allows you to do that. I'm going to defer to Mishka because he's more close to the metal on this, about his opinions and observations about event-driven paradigms and observing event-driven paradigms. The important thing for me is that they are out there, they're growing, and you have to be able to start observing things asynchronously, and it's a trick.
Yep. And I think lately I have been seeing more and more of the Jaeger kind of tracing picking up, and organizations adopting to that to get into tracing. So I think that's a great new thing. I think we just need to see more. This is a new technology, Kubernetes is new, and all of these things we are kind of now reinventing again. We did all these beautiful technologies for the VMs back in the days, and now we are reinventing all these technologies again for the containers. And I think it's exciting times, all the time, great new technologies coming, but it's also difficult to keep up on what should I use, because so many different places.
Right, and the important thing is if we go to an event-driven paradigm, which is completely message-based, that's a different way of doing business. And for those companies that understand that, or developers that understand it, my hat's off to you, because it's more complex. but it's more powerful. And then the footnote I'll put on that is, Eric Evans' book, Domain-Driven Design. It's back there on my bookshelf. Wait, I think I can point to it. There it is. It's down there at the bottom. Eric, Domain-Driven Design. But if indeed you want to master distributed applications at scale in an event-driven paradigm using Kubernetes and observability and all that good stuff, read Eric's book. It's back there on my bottom shelf.
Yeah, I'm going to put the link to that in the chat for everyone here. Let's talk about the interesting results from the poll that we just did. Kind of right on topic with what we're discussing. So number one, what are your biggest Kubernetes challenges? Number one was complexity. You're just talking about some of that, Bob. Both of you. No surprises. It's a bit to get your head around the paradigm change, the technology, all of it. So lots of ways of dealing with complex problems. What would you recommend of, okay, if Kubernetes is a complex domain, how do you break that down into digestible chunks?
Well, encapsulation is critical. By encapsulation, I mean encapsulation at the code level, but also encapsulation at the organizational level. Let's face it, Kubernetes is terribly complex, and to expect a developer or even a quality assurance engineer or anybody who's in the making of software things to be expert in Kubernetes, it's just not realistic. And there is a good case that we take a part of the organization and say, okay, you are going to be Kubernetes infrastructure experts, and you're going to learn everything there is to know, and you're going to work with the cloud providers, and you're going to work with experts like Mirantis, and you're going to get it down, right? And that's one approach. Then what to do is to make sure that the stuff that's being made is well encapsulated so it doesn't break other stuff, right? In other words, anything can, it's like the symphony. A symphony is a terribly complex thing to write, and maybe a composer can write it. But on the other hand, the oboe player, yes, needs to take instructions from the conductor, and it's the conductor's job to make sure the music flows. But the oboe's job is to play the oboe and to not get in the way of the violinist, right? And it's a stretch of an analogy, but that does work at the development, deployment, and testing level. You want to make sure the encapsulation mechanisms are very good.
Hey, it fits container orchestration. I thought that was a nice job of tying that together, Bob. So that 41% of folks said complexity. Number two was, and there are several kind of clustered together here, cultural changes in development. We kind of talked about that a little bit before, Mishka. You're welcome to say more about that. Lack of training, monitoring, those kind of fell in right behind it. So a lot of things that we've been talking about sounds pretty consistent with our participants today. Anything you want to add to that conversation on this part, Mishka?
No, I think, to be honest, I feel maybe it's just me, but I kind of feel that the complexity part is gonna be actually solved very soon. It just takes a little bit more time and kind of work from this, let's say, Kubernetes ecosystem in general. We, as an industry, we need to come up with better kind of, it basically boils down to the missing workflows for Kubernetes, because now it's the situation, like I was speaking in kind of very beginning, that since people have to start inventing these workflows and everything, from scratch, so it starts to feel like very complex because nothing works usually. You can find some piece of information or advice from internet, but maybe that advice was written like 1.5 years ago. It doesn't apply anymore with the system that you are using. So I think we are soon getting to a place where the tooling, the workflows, and everything gets kind of better and better all the time, and the complexity kind of fades away. But then kind of this additional complexity comes from all the meta technologies around Kubernetes, like how to start, better optimizing your applications and to be running on top of Kube and those type of things. But it's a different type of complexity and issues that you are dealing with then. I think that's all what I have to say. I agree. Complexity is a big thing still.
In the domain of complexity, one of the questions that submitted to us was, what are your recommendations to plan for scaling Kubernetes, right? You talked about, Bob, you talked about Kubernetes being used or created by Google, and of course, that's obviously scale, but how do we do that?
Well, use what's given to you. I mean, Kubernetes has a technology built in called horizontal pod auto scaling, which the pod, you don't have to, in other words, don't do this manual stuff anymore. If you use something like HPA, horizontal pod auto scaling, that will scale your pods automatically over the cluster based on demand. And there's some configuration stuff you have to get used to, but it's built in. The other one is to use a service mesh, of course. And there's some argument out there, well, everything I can do in a service mesh, I can do in Kubernetes using init containers and, probes and stuff. Fine, do that. But if you master a service mesh, a lot of the headache you're going to have, retry, circuit breaking, security rules, who can get into the cluster, who can get out of the cluster, service mesh takes care of all of that. However, as we talked about with concern number one, this is very complex. And it's a complexity, it's a complexity of details. It's not a complexity of intelligence. It's not that you have to be a rocket. Well, it helps if you're a rocket scientist to send rockets up, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to get this stuff. A lot of it's common sense about how to work Kubernetes, how to work the service mesh, but it takes time. And the rule of thumb, let me throw out a number which might be controversial, but I think and Mishka, I really feel free to disagree with me. I think it takes about 1 year to 2 years to get good with Kubernetes, right? That 3 months, but I'm talking bare metal. I mean, I can just give me some machines and I will make Kubernetes do what I want it to do in the way I want it to do. But that's my opinion, in my opinion only. Any other one in chat says, no, we did it in 3 months, rock on. We did it in 2 weeks, rock on. We did it in 6 days, give me your phone number because I want to know how you did it. Right. So
and you name that tune in less than 2 years.
I think getting Kube for you on bare metal or any system, basically, I can probably get it for you in 30 minutes. So that's not going to be a problem. But what happens, what happens once you have the cluster up and running? So still, that's where the most of the time is spent. So it can still take half a year to figure out how do you really use it. So totally.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I mean the complex. I mean, just let's the roles-based access control. Let's just do RBAC service accounts. And all that stuff takes time to learn. And then the other thing is this development curve, which is really dramatic. There's news here, and not only the development curve, but things get killed. For example, under Kubernetes, you have this thing called a resource called the deployment. The deployment's very nice. It allows you to create multiple replicas of one pod, and that's cool. The only problem is, I think it was from when they went from 1.5 version Kubernetes 1.5 and to, I think, I'm doing this from memory, Kubernetes 1.7, they redefined the configuration format for deployments. So all of those deployment scripts that you thought were automagical broke.
Yep.
They just broke completely. And that happens, and it happens a lot. So that means not only do you need to understand about how to get Kubernetes up and running at the cluster level, but now you have to pay significant attention to your version control. And that's a science in itself.
Yep.
Something to think about.
Also, one thing kind of related to the scaling is that maybe they are still kind of early stages, but I have been seeing personally some quite impressive also implementations around AI ops, where basically the artificial intelligence is applied basically to learn the usage pattern for certain deployments and services, and this AI kind of intelligence can auto-scale those services according to certain criteria. And it can be goal-oriented also. So there are quite exciting new initiatives happening around Kubernetes and the scaling especially.
Yeah, I'm liking AI a lot too, particularly for disaster inference, predicting when things are going to go wrong. That's a really powerful aspect. Any companies out there that are doing AI inferencing, like when my disks are going to go south, I'd like, that's a typical use case. I'd be interested to learn how they're approaching that.
Very good. I tossed up our last poll, not to inundate everyone with poll, but it kind of gives us yet another way of kind of feel of the audience, size of the organization. So we're getting some responses into that. There was also a question here. What are recommendations to avoid frequent pods restart due to Java heap memory issues in Kubernetes? Kind of a pretty specific question. Any thoughts on that we might be able to help Joseph with?
Well, I'm not the Java application developer. I don't know this particular problem, so deeply. My only advice, based on the common knowledge, would be just to increase the requests for these pods. But I don't know if that's applicable.
Isn't Java always have a heap issue? But sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
No. There's, two things come to mind, and Misha, keep me honest on this. Mishka, excuse me. One is memory allocation at the pod level. What's going on there? Again, one more level of detail, right? We need to know. The other thing I would be interested to learn is how the relationship between the runtime JVM at the container level. What's happening there? What JVM are you using? And then also, how is that JVM configured? There is no one easy answer. It's a very particular use case, and you need a little more information around that. But it would be interesting. The first thing I would do is start looking at the logs, which goes back also. My last blast for 12-factor app is number 11, which I happen to remember is logs. And if you're not logging becomes critical in Kubernetes, absolutely critical. And a consistent logging policy becomes important. You're just not throwing data out there, but you have to have those logs. They have to be consumable in a meaningful manner, and they need to be queryable easily, because that'll answer at least half of your problems.
Now, logs can be your best friend. So just give you a feel of our audience size. About 36% are in organizations of 1,000 employees or greater. So, good representatives from large enterprises, kind of in the mid-range between 50 and 999. Looks like that's about 28%. So a little bit over a quarter, and then the rest of the folks kind of fall into the 50, 49 and smaller. So good representation here is, weighted more towards the enterprise. I guess that's not too surprising, right? Giving, Kubernetes and the kinds of applications you might use it for. Would either of you agree with that, or you feel free to disagree if you think I'm...
I have actually quite good, visibility on that. So actually what we can see is that it very kind of evenly spread the usage of Kubernetes, across the smallest of the companies to the biggest of the biggest, so it's very evenly spread, the usage. So I think what we can see also in here is that we have people basically from every category. So I think that's very much in line with what we have seen also.
Good. Well, with that, guys, let's wrap things up. We've got just a few minutes before the top of the hour, and I want to take care of a couple housekeeping items. Mishka, fantastic. Enjoyed talking with you and sharing your knowledge and your observations about different organizations using Kubernetes. And Bob, your experiences and some of the models that you provided and references and some of the Katacoda resources that you provided. Fantastic. Sharing your knowledge as well. So congrats, guys. Really appreciate the last hour together. Let's just wrap up with our gift card winners. We got to take care of that. We have 4 gift card winners. They are Pavel M, James S, Stephen L, and Eric R. the good folks at Container Journal will get a hold of you about how to get a hold of those gift cards. Well, just a reminder, we have recorded this webinar, and that will be available on demand. You can find that on the containerjournal.com website. I think you'll also be able to see it on devops.com. Join me in thanking Mishka and Bob. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we want to thank you, our audience. We've spent an hour together. Your time's super valuable. We're very honored that you spent it with us. We hope you've used your time well. Have a good rest of your day and have fun with Kubernetes. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.